Hello, you're very welcome back to our news bite. Hello, Aidan, how are you?
Thank you.
Okay, there's a little bit of a drag here, but hopefully we'll get through this all right. So, Aidan, there is a big debate here in Newry about John Mitchell, and the people of Newry fondly hold John Mitchell in great esteem. And then with what's gone on in America, it has brought the whole story of John Mitchell into the forefront here. So, from what you do in your business, where do you stand on John Mitchell?
In 2007, I wrote to the council in Newry. It was just after he'd been appointed as director of Discovery International, which is the
Aidan, just come a wee bit closer to
only
the
human
phone.
rights organization in the world. And I said to them at the time that I thought it was a bit anachronistic having somebody who was such a virulent white supremacist, a supporter of slavery, and an advocate for the reintroduction of the transatlantic slave trade. I thought it was inappropriate to have him standing without any of that context provided in place of honour in the centre of Newry. I got a response back from the council which said, well, you shouldn't be judging 19th century figures by 21st century standards. And I wasn't judging them by 21st century standards. I was judging them by 19th century standards. In the 19th century, there's people like Daniel O'Connell, there was Isaac Nelson in Belfast, there was Frederick Douglass in the United States, all fierce campaigners against slavery. And yet, the person that we have standing in the middle of Newry is somebody who was such a virulent opponent of social justice, of racial equality, of human rights and civil rights. So I think in spite of what he said about Ireland, in spite of what he wrote in relation to the famine, it's inappropriate for him to be standing there without any contextualization being done. Now, we've moved on a bit. I think whenever you're looking at the multicultural nature of Ireland, the multicultural nature of Newry, the fact that there's lots of people now of African descent living in and around Newry, it's a bit embarrassing, to put it mildly, to have somebody who believed in the racial inferiority of people of African descent and African origin standing in a place of honour in the middle of Newry. So I think Newry should take some decisive action to show that's not the sort of society that we want to be. And it should take some decisive action, sort of saying, this guy really doesn't represent the Newry of the 21st century, which we want to be an inclusive place.
I suppose, Aidan, looking back through into history, into the 1860s in America, Mitchell had two sons who fought for the Confederates. If Mitchell had have went to New York instead of maybe going to down to the southern states, would he maybe went on the Union side, or rather than the Confederate side of the argument in the southern states?
I understand that he did end up in New York to start with, and then he shipped himself down south because he was a great believer in white supremacy. Other Young Irelanders didn't hold that position. Thomas Francis Meagher, who was from Waterford, I think, he was the commander of the New York 69th, which fought with enormous courage for the Union during the American Civil War. So it wasn't just about, well, he happened to be down in South Carolina or Virginia and went.
I'm sorry, Ian, I'm not sure. I think maybe we might have sort of lost you here. If you can hear me, again, looking at Mitchell here around Newry, I mean, there's Gaelic clubs around Ireland named after John Mitchell, and there's streets, the local foresters is named after him. And, when we look round and we see other, like we have Victoria Lock, we have our Albert Basin, we have Windsor Hill. I mean, if we start to take down all these names and all these statues, where do we stop?
People, a profoundly racist system.
Again, Aidan, I'm not really picking. I'm not picking Aidan up. Maybe we'll try and see can we get him again with a better link. But as we heard there, Aidan is very, very of the opinion that Newry should be probably removing the statue of John Mitchell. But the question is, will that happen? We don't know. John Mitchell has been held, I suppose, very fondly in Uri. Maybe people not understanding about the slave trade down in the southern states and the connection there. His people did come from Derry, and he lived here in Uri, and then he married and he went to America, and of course he was fined for, I suppose, sedition by the English because of the Young Irelanders. So he had he was also a journalist who wrote a fair bit about England and Ireland and what was going on at the time. And again, when he went to America, then he went to the southern states, and as Aidan said there, he became, I suppose, a slaver, if you want to call that. I'm not sure if that's the proper terminology, but it's it's very prevalent in this day and age. So we'll wait till we see can we get Aidan back again. We're trying to think we might have him here. Aidan, can you hear me now? Still no sound here. Speak Aidan to me.
1, 2, 3, 4,
Aye,
5, 6,
okay,
7, 8,
okay,
9,
and yeah,
10.
I can hear you now. So as you were saying there, that he sort of he agreed with slavery, and he went to the southern states. So in that context alone, does that mean that his statue should be removed?
I think it's important to take a proper view of it. My own opinion is that yes, the negative stuff that he did outweighs whatever positive stuff that he did. I mean, in the north of Ireland, we know that symbols say to you whether you're welcome or whether was such a proponent of the Confederacy, a supporter of the genocidal transatlantic slave trade, is saying something quite significant to folk who are maybe of African heritage and origin. And I don't think that builds an inclusive community. I mean, I was reading just the other day about a young black Antrim uh, uh, female Gaelic footballer who's been receiving racial abuse over the past couple of months and years as she's been pursuing her career in Gaelic football. I mean, there is this section within Irish society, unfortunately, which is very racist, and I think it's important, and they regard John Mitchell as being a significant symbol for them too. And I think it's important to repudiate them. And bear in mind that a lot of the cops who are doing some of the most racist things in the states are also Irish. I think making a point that we don't want this to be any part of our society is important, very important symbolically, and symbolic symbols can make significant difference and change in terms of saying this is what we want to be. We don't want to be this inward looking, not interested in other cultures, not interested in how our society can be enriched by the immigration that we ourselves practice in other parts of the world.
But I think Ian, if we look at it in the context, and again, if we remove all the elements of what happened in the past, like going back through to the Second World War, going back through what ISA was doing over in the Middle East at the minute. I mean, if we start removing historical, I suppose, symbols, then we are denying that that actually took part back in history. Is it not better sometimes? Look, this is what happened. This is what this guy was. This is what this guy stood for. Is it not better to have them there for people to see that and let people make their own mind up on it?
But that's not what's happening at the moment in relation to Mitchell and Newry. It would be something that I would support. And in fact, one of the things that I've suggested is that
Again,
the
I'm not sure.
context of Ireland, slavery and anti. Um, uh, sorry, what I said. I think it would be good to move the Mitchell statue to a place where you can.
Okay, Aidan, I'm losing you here with your audio, but I think what you were saying there, maybe move the statue to somewhere that it wouldn't be as offensive, possibly to the Newry Museum, if we have one.
It could be part of a broader exhibition to look at Ireland's slavery and
Yeah, okay, I think we're technical issues with Aidan over in London there. But I suppose when we're talking about that, we could Aidan, there is a place in Uri called Bagnall's Castle, if you know it. I'm not sure if Aidan's picking this up. And I know the council sort of used Bagnall's Castle as a tourist attraction. And can you hear me, Aidan? Yeah.
Talking about Bagnall's Castle.
Yeah, and Bagnall wasn't
Sorry,
he
did you?
didn't cover himself in glory in this area either.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, Bagnall's Castle is now a museum, and I've been in it myself, and it's a good wee museum. There seems to me to be a fair bit of space there, which you could probably put another exhibition or two in. And I would suggest that one of the exhibitions you could put in there would be one which actually contextualizes Mitchell a bit more fully than what we see down on Hill Street, and one that we can talk about Ireland slavery and anti-slavery. I think it's important to take people in their totality. The problem is we haven't taken Mitchell in his totality. And there's certainly significant figures in history. George Washington owned slaves, though I think towards the end of his life he was moving towards a more abolitionist position, and he freed all his slaves in his will. Winston Churchill obviously defeated Nazism, but oversaw famine in India while he was doing that and was a virulent racist. Sometimes the achievements which people have actually outweigh that which is negative in their lives, and you need to look at them in the round in that regard. Well, I'm not sure that Mitchell falls into that category. And I think, given the nature of Ireland that we're evolving into, more appropriate to not hold them up as um, an uncriticized national hero, but actually recognize him much more problematic that he was.
Again, Aidan, we're having serious technical problems, but I'm getting what you're saying there in relation to the Gaelic clubs that would be called after Mitchell. Where would you stand on that situation? We have the local club here in Glen called after him. The Mitchells in Uri's called after him. The Foresters, just literally 100 yards down the street from him, is named after him. So, where do we stop?
I think there's a slight difference between a public space and a private club. And I think a private club needs to actually have a look at itself and see um, whether Mitchell represents the sort of ethos that they actually want.
Again, folks, I'm sorry for the very sorry for the distraction here because the line to in there is very faulty, and but we're getting the gist of what he was saying there. He's saying like maybe the clubs that's named after him need to maybe start looking at themselves and seeing what to think of this. So it is an interesting story. It's a story that I think maybe it'll go on, and we will definitely be covering this with more detail. Hopefully, maybe some other time this week or next week, maybe we could get Aidan back again with a proper link, and we should be able to do this, and we should be able to hear him. And he was raising some very interesting points there. So hopefully, Aidan, we've got you back again.
I think I've got a proper link now. Finally got the link through from your colleague, and it
Oh,
just
this is 100%. This is brilliant. So listen, thanks a million. This is 155% better. But as he said there, if you hopefully you picked me up about the clubs being named after Mitchell, and you have the Mitchell's Club, you have you have Glen. Out there as well, you've got the Foresters in Uri, and that's only like a stone's throw from Uri. There is a couple of Mitchell's clubs in Derry as well that I know of, and it is a debate that maybe we should be having. But the question is, do we draw a line on this, or what do we do? Where do we stop being you know the symbols? And I know Northern Ireland is an awful place for symbols and flags and different things. But if we were to look at all this, where do we stop? I mean, we've got Albert Basin, we've got Victoria Lock, we've got Windsor Hill, just to name a few in Uri. We've got Bagnall's Castle, and I did say Bagnall wasn't a very nice person either back in the day, and we have a castle or a building named after him there, and you were saying it mightn't be a bad place to put the statue. So where do you stand on all this, Aidan?
I think the GAA clubs and the clubs anybody who's taken his name should actually have a proper look at what he said, proper look at what he did, and then discuss that themselves in terms of, is this what they want to represent themselves with? Is this how they want to present themselves to the world? Personally, I wouldn't want to be associated with a club with the name of Mitchell on it. I mean, it'd be like joining a club named after Katie Hopkins or Nigel Farage. And Nigel Farage GSC is not really, the sort of place that I'd want to be. Those were the sort of attitudes that Mitchell had in his day. I mean, they're the direct descendants of those sort of attitudes. So I would hope that the clubs would look at Mitchell in the total context of what he did and what he said and what he represented. I think if you want to be inclusive, you have to make sure your symbols are inclusive. And, if you want to have young black Newry people, black South Armagh people, black South Down people joining your club, and there's going to be plenty of them decent footballers and hurlers in the next couple of years, do you want to have that sort of racist symbol associated with your club? I think we need to recognize the sort of society that we're becoming, and make it inclusive for all our peoples. Irish people have travelled the world and been welcomed into other people's societies and communities. I think we must welcome people into our society and community as well, and will be enriched for it.
Well, look, there's no doubt that of course that's the way that we are going at the minute. And you did mention earlier on about the GAA and young Jamar Hall from Farkill. His father's from the West Coast, USA. And Jamar was talking in the Irish News, and I have to commend him for the brilliant article that was carried. And he's a lovely lad. I know him. I know the lad about 20 years, and he's a lovely lad. And it took great courage. And he has been racially abused at football matches, and he went out and he took action, and the referee sent him off. And then of course it went to the board, and then of course it went to he says, I says, he says, I says, and things like that. But in the context of the whole racial thing, I think what happened in America last week or 2 weeks ago has brought it all back again. And it has raised the whole issue of Mitchell. And I don't know where it'll go or what will happen. I know there is a fair amount of people would be for having Mitchell staying where he is. And okay, that's what he done. And we know what he done. But maybe the question is, do people really know what he did?
I think a lot of people don't know what he did. Though my own copy of Jail Journal, whenever I got that some years ago, as an interesting introduction by Arthur Griffiths in it, who is very much defending Mitchell and his views. So it wasn't a secret in any sort of way, and a lot of people would have been aware of this. I think it's one of these things we sort of overlooked for a long time and tried to make up excuses for. I think when you look at the depth of what his attitudes were, I think it gets an awful lot more difficult to defend. And it then becomes a much more embarrassing thing whenever we look at the diversity of Newry, South Armagh, and South Down as well now. It makes it, I think, a bit of an unwelcoming place. I think it's good now that certainly councillors are taking this a lot more seriously. I saw comments by Michael Savage and by Gary Stokes earlier in the week, which suggested that they were taking this an awful lot more seriously, which is a sea change from the sort of response that I got when I raised this first in 2007, which was, we're not interested in talking about it. So it's, I think, the combination of a bit of public attention on this, and also this specific moment in history, whenever we're looking at this people in America saying, we've had enough. We've had enough of this sort of abuse, this sort of murder, which is going on day and daily, and we want to see some changes happening. And I think that echoes out across the world. It was, I mean, if you read and remember Brian Fried's play Freedom of the City, as one of the characters in that was describing what kicked off the civil rights movement. It's about that impulse of people just across the world having had enough and saying we want to be treated like proper human beings. And I think that's resonated with a lot of people in these islands as well. And I think then it leads us to begin looking at some of the symbols that we've had around our own communities for some years and saying, well, are these really appropriate? If we want to be on the right side of history, if we want to be with those young people in New York and Minnesota out protesting against civil rights abuses of Black people, um, are the symbols that we're showing in our city centres and in our towns and villages, are they the right ones? Or are there things we're going to have to apologize to whenever whenever we meet them, whenever we sit down with them? And you know, a lot of the cops who have been abusing Black folk over the years are also Irish. So I think one of the things we need to say to them very directly is, if you want to be part of our community, you have to give up this racism. There was Imelda May's poem from last week, which was very powerful. You don't get to be racist and be Irish. So that's one of the things it's and that's one of the things which means that symbols are important. We have to take recognition of that and then say, not just are we going to tolerate this stuff, but we're going to stake out a better place in this world and try and be something better in the world than generations that have maybe gone before us, and that the worst part of our community wishes to see sustained.
Look, there's no doubt, and of course, Imelda May's poem last week was phenomenal, and it was absolutely fantastic. And I suppose if people haven't got a chance to listen to it, I would advise them, go tune in and listen to it. You'll get it on Facebook, you'll get it on Twitter, you'll get it on everywhere and anywhere. It's fantastic. But again, Aidan, when we look at these symbols, because these things happened, do we airbrush them from history, or what do we do?
Well, they've been airbrushed from history already. I mean, you walk down to Hill Street, you see nothing about his support for the Confederacy. You see nothing about his support for the reintroduction of the transatlantic slave trade. You see nothing about his white supremacist attitude. He's been airbrushed. What I'm suggesting is that we need to unairbrush him and look at him in the complexity of the man that he was, and decide whether that's somebody we want to honour. I mean, it was only 1 or 2 years ago there was a debate in the City Hall about who's the greatest man from Newry ever. And I forget who the second choice was, but it was down to two people, one of whom was Mitchell. So we're still thinking, well, this is the best we have to offer. I mean, I'm sure there's better people that we could be talking about. I mean, an inspiration to me when I was growing up was a fellow called Paddy McGuinness, who was a senior executive with Concern, did lots of great work across the world. I mean, my sister died last year, and looking at the nurses and the medical staff in the hospice where she's dead, extraordinary people. I mean, they'd be sooner be honouring them than be honouring somebody like John Mitchell. So I mean, I think Newry has got an awful lot better to offer. Maybe in the 1950s when the statue was put up, he was the only famous Newry man anybody could think of, even though he did come from Derry.
That's right. I think Dungiven or something.
Yeah,
I
I mean, I don't think that's really a good enough reason to put him up there. I mean, there's no statues of Jimmy Savile in the UK anymore. I don't think anybody'd be wandering around saying, "Let's knock up a statue to Katie Hopkins anytime soon." I mean, that's what his attitudes were like. Katie Hopkins rather than Savile. I mean, and I think, well, if it's not good enough now, if we wouldn't think to honour him in this way now, why are we still keeping him there? Because he has been airbrushed. We're not seeing the totality of the man represented in any significant way in Newry at the moment. It's only now we've begun to have a conversation about this.
And of course, obviously, what happened in America has brought this all to the fore.
Yeah.
So again, when we look at statues, and you did mention Winston Churchill, and yes, he did defeat Nazism with the help of America. And again, what he done in India, and the famine in India that he allowed to happen. I mean, where would you even stand with him. I mean, the statues of him all over the place. So where would you stand with somebody like that? Would you do the same with them?
Um, I've been thinking about this. I'm not sure what my answer in relation to Churchill is. I mean, the reason that Mitchell bothers me so much is because I come from South Armagh, and he's there in my hometown. With Churchill, I mean, Churchill's become almost a secular saint in the UK, and he was a deeply problematic person, profoundly racist. I would think that if he hadn't led Britain to during the Second World War, there'd almost be nothing redeeming to say about him, or certainly the redeeming features would be outweighed by the negativity of him. But he did, and I think if you're looking at somebody in the round, I think that's the time to make those judgments. I think what he achieved during the Second World War was so extraordinary, um, it almost outweighs what he did elsewhere. I suspect if I had some Indian friends here, they may well be disputing that quite vehemently. I read Roy Jenkins' biography of Churchill a few years ago, and Jenkins' view of Churchill is he's the greatest figure ever to have held the office of prime ministership in the UK. Well, I remember reading it and writing about it afterwards, saying that's very easy for you to say if you're not Irish or Indian. But he's a much more complex figure, and I think it wasn't just the consequences of his leadership in the UK resulted in democracy right across Western Europe. That's not an inconsiderable achievement to lay against the negativities of him. But it's right that he is considered in a more complicated way. Good historians have been thinking about that for a while. I mean, Max Hastings, who's a conservative historian and a big admirer of Churchill, he is very critical of. He's very critical of Churchill's record during the famine in India. And Washington's a similar figure like that in that he was a slaveholder, but also, he's the father of his nation, and he actually, at the end of his life, he did free all his slaves. So there's more redeeming features against Washington as well.
Yeah, I see somebody's just put up a post there about the Needham family and Sugar Island, and the Needham family were documented to own 800 slaves, or the Hill Street president of the Board of Trade and Plantations at Hill Street and Trevor Hill, etc., are associated with. So I suppose when we look at all this, Aidan, that Newry has a history with a connection to the slave trade that maybe a lot of us didn't understand or didn't know about.
Yeah, and Sugar Island is obviously one of the biggest examples of that. Um, and I think that sort of strengthens my point that I think it is something which Museum in Newry should take a much more robust look at, um, and use it as something to educate the local community about, because um, we should be aware of our links internationally as well, and the position that our country and our city had in relation to the rest of the world too. I think as we look outwards, we begin to see ourselves in a different perspective, and a newer perspective. I think with greater clarity about what's good and bad about us. I think there is an opportunity to do that by looking at the street map of Newry, look at the people who originally invested there. I mean, talk about the sort of stuff which I mean, the thing about Bagnall's Castle is it's not really celebrating him; it's saying that's where he lived, and it's interesting that that's where he lived. And the fact that the place was encased in McCann's Bakery for so many years, I find completely fascinating as well. That nobody knew it was there until they took the bakery down, and there it's perfectly preserved. Um, so. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to recognize the history, but also contextualize it as well. So there's an opportunity to do something more about that, and also make Newry a more welcoming place as well, and also make a statement in terms of where we want to be in relation to this argument around racism at the moment, this repudiation of racism, which is happening in so many parts of the world.
Well, Aidan, look, I think from our conversation this evening, we definitely have opened a whole new story. We've definitely looked at things, and I would like to thank you very much for coming on at very short notice there as well. We had a few technical difficulties at the start, but we got there in the end, and we had some brilliant conversations there about Mitchell and about what went on, and of course the whole thing about Hill Street, Sugar Island, and all those other things. So it is a story, and it's a story that probably we will continue with, and I'm sure now we have absolutely started a fantastic debate within the Newry and Mourne down South Armagh area. I'm delighted you're saying you're from South Armagh. What part of South Armagh are you from?
I'm from Clog.
Oh, you're
Eh,
Cloud man, right?
yeah, but I mean, that's another thing you should be debating. Newry morning down. I
Oh,
mean,
look, we've had that debate, and we
Newry
we
down and down, a bit more down.
yeah, yeah. There's no mention of South Armagh in it. Oh, that's another story, and that was one that really got to me because I'm a South Armagh. I'm a Camlin man here as
All
well,
right.
So, listen, Aidan, I have to say thanks a million for coming on. You have definitely given us food for thought. There's no question about that, and I'm looking forward to the comments that we're going to be getting on this. And maybe in another week or two, maybe you would come back on again, and maybe we can get the link properly going this time, and we can have another debate, and maybe we'll get a couple of other people on here and have a good debate about Newry. Newry is outlook, and Newry is welcoming people. There's no question about that, and it's fantastic. And there's no doubt what happened in America there 2 weeks ago definitely has maybe lit a flame that's spreading across the world, and who knows where it'll end up. Could you believe that it has actually started a little fire here in Newry? Well, yourself is talking about it, and I'm delighted that you were able to come on here tonight. And we much appreciate it. And as another South Armagh man, you're very welcome at Destination Uri anytime.
It's been a delight indeed, Damian, and I'd be delighted to come back anytime, talk about this or anything else you fancy.
Well, there we go. Look, there's Betty Miller. She's saying there, if Cal puts it up, interesting connections to the slave trade in Uri. I think statues should be reclaimed rather than removed. I mean, I wish there was a way to get black sculptors to find any incorporating Black Lives Matter and these figures in history. Well,
And
again,
yeah,
the conversation is starting here. And, I suppose with what's going on in the world and what's going on, here's another one. I can't help thinking if ISIS was smashing up their historical wonders or the Nazis burning books, I don't think maybe it's as bad as that, but I suppose we
look,
have to be aware, Aidan, of what's going on.
I don't think we're talking about setting a funeral pyre to Mitchell just yet, but I think there's a way in which we need to recognise the problematic nature of the man and the fact that Newry is a multicultural place, and we don't want to be discouraging our fellow citizens who are maybe coming from African origin.
Yeah, I think there's no question. You've definitely opened up a great story here about John Mitchell, and I'm sure we'll hear more of this, and we'll be watching this story very closely within the next couple of days. And I'm sure as this reaches far and wide, people will start to react because I would be of the opinion that a lot of people only know about Mitchell, what's wrote on a statue and where he's buried, but not about the man. And I suppose from a nationalist point of view, and as you said earlier on, he was held with great esteem because some of them, they knew about him and all that. But maybe that little part of his history was closed off and not spoken about. So interesting times ahead, Aidan. So it'll be interesting to hear what people have to say, and maybe we'll get you back here in a week or two. So listen, thanks
Delight.
to thanks to yourself. You're over in London there, I believe.
I am for my sins, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe get the debate about Mr. Churchill going there as well, because I know, like, going back to the famine that he was involved in. I mean, he introduced the black and tans to Ireland as well, so that's another story in itself. And as you said, that maybe the Irish wouldn't be too happy about him, but because he won the Second World War, does that still make him a figure on a pedestal? That's the other question. I don't know the answer to that.
And it's certainly a question for the British, I think, rather than the Irish. I think we can say what we think of him, and he is a complex figure. But I mean, it's people who are good to write about in history and read about in history are not necessarily the sort of people that you want to accept as people you want to hold up as an undisputed hero, an undisputed shining example. And I think that is one of the problems with Churchill. I think is that people regard him as some sort of secular saint in England, and you can't really say anything bad about him, but he is a very troubling person. He's a
Well,
very
listen,
troubling person indeed.
very interesting conversation here this evening. Much appreciated for coming on at a very short notice. I absolutely enjoyed it. And now that you're a clog man, hopefully we'll be able to keep in contact with him. So very interesting story there about John Mitchell and the complexities of John Mitchell in his life and in his writings as a young Irelander and as a nationalist and all that, and then being sent to Australia and he went to Bermuda first and all that. So more to hear about this story, and you'll hear it here first on Destination Uri. But before we go, I think I'm going to have to do the news here because I know I thought I was doing that earlier on, and I'm just going to try and get the news here. So just bear with me, and we'll get this up, and we'll do it very, very quickly. So again, thanks for staying with us due to the problem we had at the technical issue at the start, but we got that sorted in the end. So very, very good, interesting story about John Mitchell. So I'm going to do the news now. So just bear with me. So the coronavirus update. One new death in Northern Ireland. That brings the total in Northern Ireland to 538, while in the Republic, 8 more people have died, and that brings it to 1,703 people died in the island of Ireland. Sorry, in the Republic, 2,241 in the whole island. So confirmed cases in the Republic of coronavirus is 25,238. 151 people have died in the UK in the last 24 hours, and now they're talking about easing the lockdown. A total of 41,279 people have died in the UK due to the coronavirus, and 291,409 confirmed cases of coronavirus in the UK at this minute in time. And again, Scotland stays the same, over 4,000 deaths in Scotland. Wales, 6 more people with coronavirus are reported to have died in Wales, taking the total to 1,426 or 125. That figure will go up. There's no question about that when they add in all the other from the homes and different things. And again, some of the decisions made by the executive today. People living alone in Northern Ireland will be able to stay at one another's households as part of further easing of the corona restrictions. First Minister Arlene Foster announced that from Saturday, single adults can spend the night at another house in a support bubble, whatever a support bubble is supposed to be. The executive agreed to move to minimise the impact of loneliness and isolation. The relaxation does not apply to those who are shielding. The executive met today, agreed to lift a number of lockdown measures because the R number, which measures the rate of infection, is currently calculated between 5 and 0.5 and 0.9. Deputy First Minister Michelle O'Neill again thanked the public for adhering to lockdown rules and said the measures were slowing the spread of COVID-19. We are seeing a steady stabilisation of the virus, and we do not have the reason to, have, and we do have reason to be optimistic. She said the island is starting to show signs of a decline in the rate of increase in new cases as a result of all the public health interventions, community lockdown, and social distancing measures. But she added that a second wave of the virus must be avoided at all costs. We are still about saving lives, she says. And then the Deputy First Minister said, we are now in a transition period towards a new normal, but ministers would continue to be guided by public health principles as well as economic and social considerations. Well, there we have that from, and then of course there are 291 confirmed cases in Uri Morning Down with 44 deaths. In Armagh City, Banbridge and Craigavon, 538 cases with 75 deaths. Other news. Aerospace company Bombardier is cutting 600 jobs after a slowdown in business. And the GAA is considering announcing its plans for a revised 2020 championship earlier than scheduled, with a review later this month now an option. On the 29th of June, the government will reveal Phase 3 of Ireland's roadmap, and it's understood that Croke Park officials who have already put shape on this season's revised inter-county structure could press ahead and make public the new championship formats. Well, we watch that. So a very busy evening here this evening. So thanks to everybody, and a special mention to Aidan McQuade from Clog, who's living in London and told us all about John Mitchell. We'll do this all again tomorrow evening. Thanks for listening and watching.